Washington Valley Economic Council. Thank you for coming this morning. I have it on very strong recommendation that our speaker will be quite articulate and clarify every question you First, I want to thank the New Hampshire Electric Co-op again for having sponsored us for the year. And more specifically, Memorial Hospital is our business sponsor today and is paying so that we can videotape this and show it a number of times for folks who can't make it this morning. It will be on cable access. And with that, Deb said literally she can't answer questions about eligibility for each individual, but beyond that, Deb Fournier.
So good morning. I'm going to step out here just for a moment. My name's Deb Fournier. I'm a policy analyst with the New Hampshire Fiscal Policy Institute. My institute is a small nonprofit that explores and promotes public policy that will foster prosperity and opportunity for all New Hampshire residents, and we have a specific focus on low and moderate income residents of New Hampshire. So that's the perspective I'm coming from. I focus on most of the healthcare issues that we tackle, which means I do a lot of reading and writing about initiatives that the State House is thinking about doing relative to state-funded healthcare, and sometimes about what's going on in the federal budget related to healthcare. So I was asked to come and try not to bore you to death with the Affordable Care Act and New Hampshire. So this is a very high-level overview of the statute with a focus on the provisions that are most likely the ones that you have heard about. So what we're going to do is we're going to start out looking at really like a table of contents of the entire act, and then we'll go through some of the changes that happen to Medicare, since people often are concerned about those, and then we'll talk about in a little more detail the things that are going to come online January of next year, which is when the bulk of the health insurance reforms that were baked into the law actually become live. Okay? It's fine with me if you ask questions as we go along. And again, I just ask if you have individual eligibility questions. I don't work for the exchange. I don't work for the state. I don't work for the federal government. I probably can't answer them, and it might not be a good use of our time. I've put in a little detail about income ranges that within which there may be eligibility for certain benefits, and I'll do my best to answer questions about employer responsibility provisions, but I'm licensed in Massachusetts, not in New Hampshire. I can't give legal advice. I'm not general counsel for anybody in this room, to the best of my knowledge. Okay. So the Affordable Care Act in brief. If the Affordable Care Act were a book, it would have 10 chapters. Lawyers call them titles, okay? And the first title is really the one that got the most attention in the first 3 years since the law has been passed. It's the individual mandate, employer responsibility, the exchanges, the subsidies available, and the improvements to the health insurance market that are an attempt to cure some of the behavior of the health insurance market that people find the most distasteful in general. You can't hear me?
No. If you could stand in the middle, it'd be better. Because what the problem is there's two fans. There's one there and one there. So if you can be kind of like in the middle.
It's a clicker. Okay. So Title I. And Title II and III are the changes to the public programs. We have two public health insurance programs, dominant public health insurance programs in the United States. Medicare, which is largely for people who are disabled and people who are retired, and Medicaid, which is our low-income, our public health insurance primarily for low-income people. Okay, so those are the first three chapters of the Affordable Care Act, and those are the ones that, by and large, have gotten the most play overall. Okay, but there's seven other chapters to the book. Okay, and many of these are operating right now. Most people don't hear about them. Titles 4 and 5 are about improving the public health infrastructure in states so that there's adequate capacity to issue vaccinations, do testing for lead, blood poisoning, et cetera, things like that. and to improve overall population health, to try and tackle the larger issues that we have with obesity, chronic health conditions relating to that, cardiac disease, diabetes, so on and so forth. Title V is about trying to improve the primary care workforce. Primary care is at a premium almost everywhere in the country, right? And so there are initiatives put into the Affordable Care Act to make going into primary care more affordable for people, to incent people to go into underserved areas and serve there as a primary care provider, to get people trained to perform primary care through vehicles other than advanced graduate medical education, so people can become nurse practitioners, and to issue some kind of scholarships so that taking that leap is affordable for people when they are in the field and earning a non-specialist level of reimbursement for providing health care. Chapter 6 is about tackling waste, fraud, and abuse in our public health insurance programs so that we're not spending more than we need to and that people aren't gaming the system. And 7 is a nice gift to basically the pharma, a component of the pharma industry. Chapter 8 was the Class Act, which was a voluntary long-term care insurance program. So just a quick background. In the United States, Medicare is not the dominant funder of skilled nursing facility care, of long-term care, okay? Medicare pays for 100 days of that level of care, but it's usually following an acute event, a hospitalization, an injury, a surgery, okay? Medicaid, the public health insurance program for low-income people, is one of the dominant, if not the dominant provider of long-term care in the United States. But you have to have sufficiently low income to qualify for it. So one of the things that was baked into the Affordable Care Act was the idea that people could voluntarily put wages aside and buy themselves a $50 a day benefit for long-term care services. But essentially, when the actuaries looked at it, they said unless it's mandatory, unless everybody puts a certain amount of dollars into the fund, it won't pay for itself. And so when the fiscal cliff deal was passed earlier this year, Title 8 was repealed. So it's technically on the books, but now it's not. Okay. Title IX is the revenue provisions that pay for the bill. And Title 10 cleans up all of the problems, Scrivener's errors, things that we considered in the underlying 9 chapters. Make sense? Okay. Let's go on. So the Supreme Court case. So I read so many predictions and I talked to so many people. I'm not a constitutional lawyer, and I talked to lots of other lawyers and people who do teach constitutional law. Nobody guessed this result. Nobody, okay? Everybody thought, well, the individual mandate will go down and maybe the consumer protections will go down and maybe the whole thing will go down. But nobody thought the entire statute would stand and that Medicaid expansion would become simply an option. The Supreme Court said it is within the taxing authority of Congress to penalize people financially for not buying health insurance, but that to threaten them with their entire Medicaid spend in their state budget is unduly coercive. So what that means is, for most states, what it means is Medicaid might be the largest component of their state budget, and it might be the largest source of federal dollars that comes into the state budget. And the Supreme Court said you can't threaten a state with its biggest pot of state money for not going forward with expanding Medicaid to all these other people. We find that is beyond the scope of your authority, so it's now optional. If you don't choose to do the Medicaid expansion as a state, you're not threatening the rest of the funding that comes into your state for Medicaid, for your existing Medicaid program. And that's it. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay, let's go on. So this is a question I get a lot, so I just put it in up front. How is the Affordable Care Act paid for? Well, those Title IX, those revenue provisions, are baked into the statute, right? And they are largely assessments levied on industries that are related to or part of the healthcare industry. So assessments on pharma, assessments on insurance carriers, medical device manufacturers. There are some increases on taxes on really generous insurance packages, and for high income earners, so individuals with income at $1,000 a year, or couples at $250 or more, their FICA tax is going to go up. And then, of course, there's the revenue that will come in from people paying the penalty for not being insured, right? And that generates revenue enough to pay for the outlays in the statute. Can we go back just for a sec? I did a little arithmetic at the top. So the CBO did some projections last July about what would happen if the Affordable Care Act were repealed. And this is the inverse of their math. They said if you repeal the Affordable Care Act, you will save us $1 trillion in direct spending, but we'll get rid of $1.2 trillion in either savings or additional revenue. So the net of that is that the Affordable Care Act is booked as reducing the federal deficit by $109 billion from now until 2022. Because, in large part, now we can go to the next slide. There's a big chunk of money that came out of Medicare. Almost $1 trillion, $716 billion was saved in Medicare. And essentially what a third of that is, we can go to the next slide. A third of it is changes to reimbursement to Medicare Advantage, which is Medicare administered through managed care companies. And they essentially make 15 to 20% more than fee-for-service, traditional direct Medicare. And so the government gave their reimbursement rates a haircut. They've made some changes to how hospitals are reimbursed, which essentially is a haircut for them also, but tries to change the incentive for reimbursement so that it's attached more to quality outcomes than to every service provided. And then there's some efficiencies generated from everything else. The important thing I want people to realize is no benefits or services were reduced from the Medicare benefit design. Right? There's nothing taken away from Medicare beneficiaries currently or future Medicare beneficiaries. The benefits and the services are protected under federal law. Does that make sense? Okay, let's go on. Oh, okay. Oh, and the donut hole, sorry. Yeah, that's how I feel about it, and this is my job. Right? So, the other changes to Medicare, I'm going to borrow your table, I hope you don't mind, is that the donut hole in Part D is closed. So in the pharmaceutical benefit for Medicare, there's this thing called the donut hole, where you have to spend up to a certain amount, and that's covered by Medicare, and then you hit that amount, and then the Medicare beneficiary has to pay out of pocket until it gets to the next amount, and then Medicare kicks in again. And beneficiaries hated it. It was terrible. So the Affordable Care Act has a goal of closing the donut hole in 10 years. So the first year, people who hit the donut hole got a $250 rebate. Last year, people got half off of their brand name drugs. And every year, there'll be more and more closure of the donut hole until 2020, right? Yeah. And then it'll be gone, and the pharmaceutical benefit will be whole.
Is that happening right now?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, right now. Okay. So when people talk about the implementation of the Affordable Care Act, what they're really talking about is all the things that are going to happen beginning January 1st of next year. And specifically, that means the opening of health benefit exchanges. They're sort of changing the terminology. They're calling them the health benefit marketplaces now, just to confuse everybody. So the health benefit exchanges, the operation of the individual mandate, the bulk of the consumer protections baked into health insurance law, and the potential of enacting the Medicaid expansion. That's what people mean by implementation. The titles we talked about, remember the first 10 chapters we talked about? Titles, many of those, 4 through 10, are operating. And some components of the first 3 titles are also currently in operation also. But the bulk of the major reforms happen in June, July, August, 9 short months. Okay.
Can I ask
Yeah.
a clarification
Yeah.
on the Medicaid expansion?
Yeah.
Your comment was that it became an optional,
Yeah.
but it would not jeopardize
The existing.
federal funding.
Right.
But it isn't the if states choose to do the expansion, the federal government pays for
Right,
that
and-
over a period of time. So
yeah,
if you
yeah.
choose not to opt to expand, you're foregoing those dollars.
Right, and we'll talk about, I have a lot of slides at the end about the Medicaid expansion. So we'll talk about that then, but you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Okay, so the exchanges are going live. They're supposed to start being able to offer health insurance coverage to people in the individual and small group markets January 1st of next year. Okay, this is like people in shorthand often think about this as an Orbitz for health insurance, right? You'll be able to go online and fill out some demographic information, or you'll be able to go to a storefront and actually fill out an application with somebody or on the phone. I think there's also a mail-in requirement too. Like, you're supposed to be able to access the exchange and application from almost any access point, whether you have online service or comfort with online, or you rather do phone or in person or on your own. Okay.
Is that also optional by state?
No, thank you for saying that. Federal law requires every state to have an exchange. States all had the option to create an exchange. If a state opts not to have an exchange, then the feds will build one for you. New Hampshire chose not to go forward with building a state-based exchange, so we have a federally facilitated partnership exchange that is supposed to open its doors for enrollment on October 1st of this year. Oh, yes.
Is this the same as a health information exchange?
No,
It's different. Okay.
that's a great question. So a health information exchange, there's so much happening in healthcare right now. A health information exchange is about making it possible for a community or a state or a country to have electronic medical records that they can all see from any vantage point. So everybody who gets into a health information exchange that is interoperable, which is the big word that means everyone who wants to participate can see everybody else's medical records. It's sort of the hub for making those transactions visible and work for everybody. That's a completely separate, actually,
But it's something that's being.
but equally important. And New Hampshire is working on a health information exchange, right? Right. The capacity for people who are caring for their parents to be able to see what's happened in the latest visit, or at least the medications that were described, can be of benefit to people, or simply people not being able to remember. I don't know what the doctor said to me last time. I don't know what my blood pressure is, and someone can say, give me your name, give me your social security number, do I have your permission to look at your record? Yeah, and then it comes up. Even though the last treatment that the person had was, if everybody's connected to this hub, was in Wolfboro, but the doctor's in Conway, right? But thank you, that's a great question. People who shop, individuals who shop in the health benefits exchange, if they have incomes between 100 and 400% of the federal poverty level, will be able to access subsidies for buying their health insurance that's available to them from the federal government, and that will defray most of the cost of the premium. So, and the level of subsidy ranges depending on your income level. But those subsidies are only available to people who are income eligible and who shop in the exchange. If you have that income level and you shop outside of the exchange, you won't be able to access it. Okay, and that's for the individual and small group market. Does that make sense? Okay. And there are a lot of people on the books who look like they have income within that range that would make them eligible for shopping in the health benefits exchange. Okay. So all of those insurance packages in the exchange have to meet something called the essential health benefits, right? So they have to offer coverage in these 10 categories so that there aren't major pockets of coverage that someone would not have if they purchased here. And every state, because these are just broad categories, right? Like how many services or what kinds of services available in each category is essentially something that the state had to choose. Right? Because one of the categories is maternity care. Well, do you just mean the day that mom shows up to deliver, or are we talking about the 9 months beforehand? Right? So every state chose what's called a benchmark plan, which is there were requirements within which the state had to choose which plan it was. Our state chose Matthew Thornton Blue. And that fleshes out how many of which kinds of service in each of these categories is the minimum that each of the health insurance products in the exchange have to have. Does that make sense? All right. So we have a partnership exchange. The dominant functions of the exchange are, eligibility, enrollment, plan management, consumer assistance, and financial management. So eligibility, enrollment, eligibility is, the exchanges are going to screen people for any kind of coverage that they are eligible for, not just private market coverage. Someone comes to the exchange and says, this is all my income and this is where I live and this is my family structure. The exchange is supposed to be able to screen people and say, well, actually, you're eligible for Medicaid. And then the Medicaid agency will enroll them, right? For all the private market plans that are sold on the exchange will be able to screen people and enroll them for whatever plan the shopper chooses. Plan management is the exchange's function of making sure that the plan sold in, and this is an overly simplistic description of this, that the plans sold in the exchange comply with all the federal requirements, okay? And consumer assistance is exactly what it sounds like. Helping people enroll, doing outreach and enrollment so people know where to enroll, how to get screened for eligibility, et cetera. New Hampshire, because it's a partnership exchange, has opted to try to do two of those functions, consumer assistance and plan management. And there are some political difficulties that might make it difficult for us to do the consumer assistance function, but that is something that we've applied for. And we received the federal money. There's just a political issue happening right now that is making it possible that we won't accept the money to do the consumer assistance function. Okay. So here are the income ranges. Yes, I'm sorry.
Quick question, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no.
2 slides ago that showed how fast I'm keeping up with everything.
No, I know. It's crazy.
Defining the family of 4, in other words, does that extend to, the 26, the dependents that are under 26 or 26 and under? In other words, are they household members?
It
living
is
in the
household.
group,
It
or-
is household income. That is my understanding. But this is all going to be done through the Treasury. So it will also be done by adjusted gross income. So however your annual income stacks up as a household at tax time is my understanding. Again, I'm not great at determining exactly under which definition of what things are happening because Medicaid has its own eligibility changes. So
I was just trying to understand the depth of, in other words, does it cover family members under 26 that are not living in the household?
Well, that's a separate consumer protection option, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But in terms of being eligible for benefits or subsidies, I believe it's being done on the basis of household income, which I would assume would not include a dependent, someone who is 26, but no longer living in your house. I can't really see. We're starting to get. I really can't. I'm not sure, and I don't want to say because I don't want to give people bad information. Yes.
If New Hampshire doesn't accept federal funding for consumer assistance, what effect will that have?
Well, it will mean that the state might have to look for other sources of funding to hire people to do outreach and enrollment.
New Hampshire will still have to do the outreach.
No, New Hampshire doesn't have to do the outreach and enrollment, but it's said that it wants to.
Okay. It has to choose 2 functions.
No, it doesn't have to choose.
Okay.
New Hampshire, the people who are working on this in Concord thought, well, consumer assistance, that's something that should be done on the ground in New Hampshire because we know our communities and we know who knows in our communities how to reach people and where to do outreach and enrollment and what those specific challenges will be for Conway versus Brookline versus Lebanon. The state is very different in a lot of different regions, right? And what the needs are and how people communicate and interact with each other will be different according to those regions. So it's something that the state wanted to do, but we're just having a little bit of I think, a political difficulty right now. Okay. So to get the subsidies, this is the premium subsidy schedule. So what it means is, for people within these income ranges, the percentage points are the percentage of their income, however it's defined, that they will have, the limit of their income that they will have to pay towards a premium. Another way of thinking of it is that no more than those percentages of a person's income will go towards paying a premium in the health benefits marketplace. Does that make sense? So people will be protected to some extent if they have income from 100 to 400%, and the government with these they're called advanced premium tax credits, will pay the remainder of whatever's left of the premium after the 2 or 8 or 9.5% of the income has been paid towards the premium. And that depends on the value of the product that the person chooses. There will be products available at different ranges in the exchange, some of which have more cost sharing than others. So if someone wants a high premium, low out-of-pocket plan, they'll be able to choose that. And if they want something that's the inverse, which is they want to pay all their money up front and not have to worry very much about out-of-pocket, they'll be able to do that too. If we go on one more slide, there are also cost-sharing protections for people at the very bottom end of the lowest income ranges, so that at some point they know what the level is of out-of-pocket that they will pay in addition to the premiums. And this is, again, is for individual and small group market. Those out-of-pockets might be very different for someone in a large group plan or an employer-sponsored insurance plan. But for people who are purchasing on their own or in a small group, these are the limits that the protections that they may have. Yes, ma'am.
So the premium payments in this scenario are all tax.
Can you say more about that?
Well, currently, you're on
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Louder?
currently under a, so you're covered by employer. That's premium tax. How does that work on the exchange?
So my understanding is that the premium payment, if you're asking, are they pre-tax sort of,
Yeah, I mean, is there,
I don't know. So what I understand is
It out before,
before it's taxed.
taxes, then it lowers your income.
Right,
So therefore your
right.
tax burden.
No, I understand that. What I don't know the answer to that question. What I understand is that the timing of how it's reconciled is that at tax time, the measure of your income is taken, you're eligible for this subsidy, that's paid, you pay your premium, and it's all done through the U.S. Treasury. That's my understanding. Right. Okay, let's go on. So, the individual mandate. So that's a very broad outline of the exchange. Okay? The individual mandate says that someone must have minimum essential coverage, and that if they do not, that a penalty can be levied against them. Okay? Now there are certain exceptions to this. There's a religious exemption. I think there's a tribal exemption for members of federally recognized Indian tribes, but I'm not 100% on that, but I'm pretty sure that's true. And then there's an affordability exemption. So if the insurance available to you is more than 8% of your income, however your income is calculated for the purposes of the law, then you are not subject to the individual mandate. So what that means is if you choose to forego being insured, you will not pay the penalty. Okay? Does that make sense? And then the penalty starts out low and gradually increases over time. So next year, the penalty will be either $95 or 1% of your income, whichever is greater. And then by 2016, it will grow to $695 or 2.5% of your income, whichever is greater. And again, it'll be reconciled as part of your federal tax liability. There will be no need for there to be a state income tax structure created to reconcile this. It's all done through federal income tax mechanisms. Did you have a question?
Has any estimates or projections been done on with that exemption around the 8% whatever you said?
Oh, how many people will fall into that?
How many people will still be uninsured or potentially uninsured?
Yeah, that's a good question. I
that's
don't
the first time
know.
I've heard that.
I don't know. The Affordable Care Act is not a panacea. It will not insure everyone in the United States. There will be people who will, for matters of principle, simply refuse to participate. There will be people for whom it is simply cheaper to pay a penalty than to become insured, right? And there will be people whose lives are too chaotic, they are not capable of getting into an organized system of any kind. And there are people whose immigration status will prevent them from participating. Okay? So there will be people who remain uninsured. How many of them remain uninsured because the insurance is unaffordable to them, I don't know, but I think that's a very good question.
What about pre-existing conditions?
We'll get to the consumer protections in a moment. Okay. Sue, are you ready? Should we go on? Yeah.
So even those individuals who pay the penalty of $95, they're still going to be covered. I mean, they're still going to be able to walk in and get health coverage even though they don't have insurance and they're not going to be denied, right?
Oh,
So
no.
they pay for it.
No. Right. So federal law says, to hospitals, someone presents in your emergency department, you have to take care of them. Right? That won't change.
Yeah.
Right? We're trying to financially incent people to get into the program, but there's been no change to that baseline requirement, right? But what I think will happen is that many healthcare facilities and healthcare providers will have their own consumer assisters who will say, oh, you're uninsured? Let's screen you for some kind of insurance because you might be eligible for all kinds of insurance. I think that is a likely thing that will happen. Okay, so the penalty will be assessed as a part of the federal tax liability. And I did get this question often when the Affordable Care Act was first passed. There are no criminal penalties for failure to pay. There are only the traditional civil penalties used by the IRS. Okay, and they have said that they will not use excessive force. Yeah, it's the wrong word.
Put you in jail.
Break your arm.
Right. Criminal.
Just make it
Right.
simple.
Right. Criminal penalties mean they won't try to put you in jail for not. You won't be charged with tax evasion for not paying the penalty. And the usual civil penalties mean they'll go through the usual collections process to collect it from you.
And ruin your credit.
I won't comment on that, but
Some pressure.
Right.
Yeah, I mean,
right.
everything's relative.
Traditional enforcement action. Okay. So your insurance also has to be particular kinds of insurance in order for the individual to be considered insured for the purposes of the individual mandate. So most of the insurance that is issued and purchased right now will meet minimum essential coverage requirements. Government, Medicare, Medicaid, VA benefits, Peace Corps benefits, right, will be considered minimum essential coverage. Insurance plans in the individual market, employer market, and then grandfathered plans, which are I couldn't do it, but a much smarter person than me could do an hour just on the grandfathered plans, which are basically plans that don't have to meet all of the new consumer regulations, but were on the books when the law passed, are all considered compliant for the purposes of the individual mandate. One of the things that the Affordable Care Act is trying to do is push this ethos of coverage. They're not trying to make you get rid of what you've got, but just to move everybody forward in terms of thinking that the new norm is that everyone has health insurance coverage, right? And then, so the vision only, dental only, those sorts of policies probably will not meet the minimum essential coverage compliance requirement. Okay. So, this is the one everybody wants to talk about in this room, right? Employer responsibilities, right? Okay. So, all employers are not required to offer health insurance. Employers with fewer than 50 full-time, non-seasonal employees are not required to offer health insurance. But if an employer does have 50 full-time employees who are not seasonal, and I'm going to point at you for all these definition questions now. What is a full-time employee? What is seasonal? Are questions that lawyers are fighting about right now. So that's the threshold requirement. If you are one of those employers, then there's a number of things that would need to happen in order for that employer to face a penalty. So the employer has to offer health insurance. That insurance has to either be less than 9.5% of an employee's individual income, okay? Or it has to cover at least 60% of the cost of the coverage. Okay? So if the insurance offered doesn't meet those two criteria, and then an employee goes to the exchange and gets a subsidy. So if they have income low enough to get a subsidy and they go to the exchange and they get a subsidy, then the employer potentially faces penalties for every employee that they have. Okay? It's $2,000 to $3,000 per employee, but the first 30 are discounted for the purposes of assessing the penalty. Okay? Make sense? Yeah.
Say that again?
Yeah, no, I know. So for when U.S. Treasury is counting up what the penalty is, they're going to assess a $2,000 to $3,000 penalty per employee, but they're going to not count the first 30.
$30,000.
30 people.
Well, 30 people. Oh.
Right.
Oh, all right. That
They're
makes
trying to give employers a break. Now, right? So, but you'll notice here, for those of you who purchase for your employees, $2,000 to $3,000 per people. Where does that fall in terms of what you pay right now for your insurance for them, right? Right? The incentive is in a weird place here, right? Or, I shouldn't say that. To the extent that people expect employers to be the place that they buy their or get their health insurance, right? And an employer is really bent on not doing that. The financial incentive here is for them to just say, okay, I'll pay, but I do think there is a growing level of thought that eventually employment and health insurance need to be divorced. That's not a very popular thought. My dad hates it when I talk about that. He absolutely hates it. But I do think that and it's not popular, but it is a growing circle of thought that maybe those things eventually become separate. We started offering people health insurance benefits as a work benefit after the Second World War, because there was actually a recession going on, and there wasn't a lot employers could do, and so they were like, oh, this will be an extra benefit. There was a lot of labor stuff going on. They're like, here, but the cost of healthcare at that time is radically different than it is now, right? So anyway, so that's that. And then, I made a chart, but it doesn't look very nice. Yeah, yes.
I read somewhere that in terms of full-time employees, that if you had part-time employees, for example, we have instructors who are in different states all around the country. They may teach a weekend a month. They may teach 10 days a year. And they said you were supposed to take all those people and divide them by X number of hours, and then those became full-time employees that you added on to what you
Right.
actually had here in New Hampshire.
Right. So, like I said, lawyers and accountants all over the country are becoming very creative about how all that's going to happen. I can't answer those questions for people like who is considered a full-time employee and for what purpose. Is it an aggregate or is it an individual hourly basis? I can't answer that. I would not at all be surprised if that's the case. Okay. So I tried to make a nice chart, but it didn't work out. So firms with more than 50 people, the thing that triggers the potential penalty is the accessing by an employee of a subsidized product in the exchange and getting the subsidy. And then the assessment amount, $2,000 to $3,000 per employee, depending on the particular circumstance. Okay. So there's some other employer responsibilities, and some of these vary in terms of what employer size they apply to, and some of you as employers might be doing some of these already. There's the requirement for reasonable break time for nursing employees, okay? There's the requirement for notice that now on W-2s, employers are having to reflect the cost of the annual coverage that is provided to employees. Next year, in 2014, employers are going to have to, in writing, notify their employees of the existence of an exchange and the potential to get a subsidized product there. They're going to have to explain the employee's potential eligibility for that, depending on what kind of employer-sponsored insurance is given to them. They're also going to be notified of the potential to lose their employer contribution if they access the subsidies in the exchange. Yes?
Would this be a good time for me to explain why I'm here?
If you would like, but I'd really like to keep going. I only have about 20 minutes left.
Is there
So-
a portion at the end that may be better for me to bring up?
Sure,
Okay.
yeah, let's do that.
Thank you.
And the summary, this is my favorite part. The summary of benefits. Employers are going to have to provide their employees a summary of benefits that is no more than 4 pages, that is both linguistically and culturally appropriate. So I think you have to go to graduate school just to learn how to just produce that document, right? That's turning insurance language into regular person vocabulary is a challenge. Doing it to address all the cultural and linguistic needs of your employees is also going to be a challenge.
Can I ask one quick question?
Yeah.
It says some employers must provide, and it wasn't clear to me if all employers,
Well,
regardless of how many
some
employees?
some employers, for some of the requirements, like the nursing, the break for nursing moms, is applicable technically to all employers, but but employers with 50 or fewer can ask for a waiver to get out of that. Sort of, okay, makes sense.
You don't have to go through the rest.
Okay, yes, sir.
Are you still referring to employers with 50 or more, or
No, I'm not. I'm saying some of these notice requirements apply to all employers, some require to employers with 50 or more. Okay, and then employers generally need to be aware that there were also changes made to health savings accounts, flex spending accounts, any of those products that they offer to help out their employees with defraying healthcare costs. There were changes made to them, and to the extent that an employer offers them, they and their bookkeepers and their tax people need to understand what those changes were, right? So that the appropriate information is given to their employees. Okay, so the consumer protections. Somebody was asking about these, right? So in gray at the bottom, those are the consumer protections that went into effect already. They went into effect 9 months after the law was passed, and they are applicable to plans that have been issued since that date. Okay? So no lifetime limit. So if someone gets really, really sick, right, and they have a level 3 cancer diagnosis, they have a very intensive year of treatment, they might spend $1 million in healthcare resources. There have been traditionally lifetime limits, like you could, in all the years that you access your health insurance, could not spend more than a particular amount. Affordable Care Act takes out those kinds of limits. Same is true for preventive coverage. Insurance policies issued after this date, insurance policies have to offer preventive coverage, so preventive services at no copay. Right, and there's a whole list of what all of those services are supposed to be. Pre-existing exclusion for kids is no longer permitted under these new policy issued after that date, as well as rescission. This is the one that people really hate. So someone gets sick, they're insured and they get sick, and they get kicked off of their plan, right? That's, I think, one of the insurance market practices that people just feel is so distasteful to so many people, is now not permitted under plans issued after September of 2010. The consumer protections in green at the top are going to go into effect in January of next year. So no annual limit. So if you have a bad year of needing a lot of healthcare resources, there will no longer be an annual limit that you can cap out on, right? Pre-existing conditions for exclusions for adults will no longer be permissible. Community rating and guaranteed issue and renewal. Community rating takes away variables that underwriters traditionally use to assess risk and therefore price of insurance policies. So community rating means that people are rated against community, and that there are only certain variables that can be used. And I think now it will be next year geography, age, but there will only be a 3-to-1 variable allowed for age, as opposed to now, which can be nearly any variable for people who are older. There's no variable for gender any longer, because women often had higher ratings than men because they are childbearing, and that is an expensive set of services to access. So that's community rating, kind of bring some of those variables down a little bit. And together, excuse me, is guaranteed issue and renewal. If someone shows up and they fill out the form and they can pay the bill, the issuer has to sell them insurance. They can't deny someone because they have a pre-existing condition, because they are a female of a certain age. Tobacco use is also a permissible rating variable still. Okay. So community rating and guaranteed issue and renewal are sort of the trade-off we made for the individual mandate with the insurance industry, right? So we said we're going to incent most people to get into the insurance market to get covered. And in return, you were going to take anybody that shows up, insurance industry. Even if they got one leg half blown off and they look like Bill the Cat, you're going to insure them, right? Okay. Oh, and let's go back. Let's talk a little bit about, at the very bottom, one more, and then we'll get to the Medicaid expansion. Medical loss ratios are requirements on health insurance carriers now that they spend a certain proportion of their premium dollars they receive on your health care, right? So, and the ratios are 80 to 85% depending on particular specifics, have to go, of the premium dollars they receive, the insurance carrier receives, thank you. My Mark Rubio impression.
Except he didn't take enough, it didn't work.
I felt for him, poor guy, I really did. Okay, so medical loss ratio. So 80 to 85% of the premium dollars received have to go back to the care of the members enrolled with that insurance carrier. And if the insurance carriers don't meet that ratio, then they have to issue a rebate to everybody who's enrolled with them. New Hampshire got a waiver to ease in those medical loss ratio requirements for the insurance industry. And as a result, very few people got rebate checks last year. But it is good law, and I think our waiver is ending. So all the insurance carriers will be subject to this. And then an appeals process. So in addition to the appeals process that can happen inside of an insurance company now, there's an external one. So that people can go to the insurance department and say, look, this is medically necessary, whatever the situation is. My doctor says so. This is the reaction I'm getting from my carrier. Can you help me? Because I want to continue to grieve or appeal this decision. Okay, so it kind of gives people two bites at the apple, so to speak. Okay, so I'm about to end the private market end of things. Everybody ready? Everybody still with me? Yeah?
Is the system set up in such a way, it sounds like we have a business with over 50 employees, so we're really concerned.
Yeah.
But is it set up in such a way that it sounds like it will be cheaper for most employees to go to the exchange as opposed to us having to
I don't know, because I think that employer-sponsored insurance, large group insurance, is, from the employee perspective, is priced very differently than people who purchase in the individual market. So something we should talk about with the exchange is that small employers with up to 50 people, will be able to shop in the small group market in the exchange for their people. And hopefully, in the second and third year, some of the administrative and billing and even enrollment functions that an employer has to do will be taken over, will be provided by the exchange. It's one of the things that we're hoping for, is that they take on those sorts of things. And within that model, employers might be able to say to their employees, hey, we'll give you this amount of money towards the cost of whatever you're going to pay in the exchange. So we'll help, but we're not going to cover the mass majority. You go get your subsidy, and you go get your cost sharing protections, and we'll still give you $30 a month or whatever it is. I don't know, right? But in terms of the actual pricing, I don't know. My impression is that on the employee side, when you're in a large group insurance plan, that the costs look much lower to the employee than in the individual market. But that's something that you'll have to explore, and I think that people should explore, because what's going to work for one company isn't going to work for another. They're self-funded or not. So I'm sorry, I really can't.
So if you have less than 50, I work for a law firm.
Yeah.
Three of us.
Yeah.
So if we're all on individual plans right now, I have the option to be on, if I don't like my individual plan, to shop the exchange. And are there different tiers? Like I read somewhere there's a bronze, silver, gold, and platinum.
Yeah, I really didn't want to get into that, but there'll be 4 metal tiers within the exchange: bronze, gold, silver, platinum, and they will reflect how much cost sharing you want to do. So the bronze will have the lowest premiums, but probably the most out of pocket. And then as you go up, your premium will be higher, but your out of pocket will be lower, and probably as you go up, the benefit design might be richer, right? The essential health benefits covers the minimums of what insurance policies will have to have in the exchange, but an insurance carrier can offer more than that and offer a higher premium, right? If they give the basics plus some extra stuff that people really like.
So you do have the option of changing
You will.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Exchange, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. Right. And
Will that affect like the HSAs and all that stuff? And
I can't answer that. There are changes to HSAs, but I don't know how those interact with what will be offered in the exchange. And also, like, the deadline for insurance companies in New Hampshire to say that they want to offer an exchange is tomorrow. So we don't even know yet what those plans might look like, or who the carriers are that are going to offer, or how many products they're going to offer, right? So there's a lot for people still to learn. And if we're on target, enrollment, the moment at which people should be able to begin to shop in an exchange will be October. Yes, sir?
Will the exchange have flat rates, not based on age?
No.
In other words, if
No.
everybody in the same exchange are going to get the same amount in that rate?
I don't think so. No, there will be some rating available. I mean, possible. Permissible is the word I want there. But the number of variables and the scope of variables will be limited to a certain extent. And then again, if you are income eligible for a subsidy, those subsidy limits will apply to you, and only a certain percentage of your income can go towards your premium. And then the out-of-pocket maximums will also put a hard limit on what you will pay in addition to your premium for deductibles, co-insurance, co-pays, et cetera. For people over 400% of the federal poverty level, right, it's not a panacea, I'll say it again. It doesn't insure everybody, and there's no rate setting. There's nothing in the law that says you can't charge people more every year. You know, like premiums can't go up, right? There are subsidies to defray the costs for people from low to moderate incomes. And there are pilots and demonstrations to try to get market competition to work so that they have to compete to keep prices low. We'll see whether that works, you know? Okay. Okay, now let's go on. So I'm much more comfortable in Medicaid than I am in the private market stuff.
tell you're anxious to move on.
I am. But there is so much in the private market side, and I think it's so particular to the kind of firm and the kind of business and how many people, and is it seasonal, and where are all the seasonal people, and I am just live in fear of being recorded and giving bad advice, and so, okay. So the Medicaid expansion. So we talked about the fact that in the Supreme Court decision, the Medicaid expansion is now optional. So I want to talk really briefly about what Medicaid in New Hampshire is, okay? All right. So Medicaid is our public health insurance program for low-income people. And in the past, how it's worked is this. You have to be both low income and fit into a particular group of categories. And primarily in New Hampshire, that is kids, people with disabilities, low-income seniors, pregnant moms, and in some limited instances, very low-income parents. Okay? So you have to be low income and fit into one of those categories. It is jointly funded by the feds and the state. The feds always pay a fixed percentage of our Medicaid cost. We are a relatively wealthy state, so we get the lowest possible matching rate, which is 50%. So they always pay half, at least. Sometimes for particular groups of people, they pay a little bit more than that. This program's been on the books since 1965, okay? And the federal government has always maintained its obligations to Medicaid. Okay. Every year in New Hampshire, between state dollars and federal dollars, every year we spend $1.4 billion on Medicaid. And we cover 10% of the state population at a minimum. Okay? So what I want you to remember is fixed percentage of the cost, mostly kids, moms, people with disabilities, seniors, and a few parents. Okay? And 1.4 billion. Okay, so let's look at the pie chart of who's actually in our Medicaid program. Can you guys see that? 60% are children. The other 12% are pregnant women and moms, and in some limited instances, women who have breast and cervical cancer. They're very low-income women who have breast and cervical cancer. Everybody else are people with disabilities, whether those are children with profound disabilities, adults with physical disabilities, adults with intellectual or mental disabilities, and seniors. Okay? So that's when we're talking about Medicaid right now. That's who we're talking about. Who isn't on there?
Single adults.
Right. childless adults. So our coverage for parents in New Hampshire Medicaid is a parent has to have income of 40% of the federal poverty level. So for 2 people, that's an annual income, however it's counted, of a little more than $6,000 a year. Okay? So my next chart, I think, looks at that pretty closely. Right? If you are not pregnant, if you do not have a disability, if you're not expecting a baby, if you are just poor and you're an adult in New Hampshire, we don't offer Medicaid currently to that population. And that's not been the way the program was grown. The program has grown over time, you know, add a group here, add a group there, add a group here, add a group there. Right? And mostly the original idea of it was Medicaid was for people who could not work and benefits were associated with work. So if you could not work and you didn't, you know, then we were going to give health insurance coverage to people who fell into those categories. And it's grown and grown and grown and grown over time.
8,000, is that an individual salary? 8,000, is that like a couple?
No, that's an individual. Those are all individual numbers. Those are not household or family numbers. Right. Okay. So enter the Medicaid expansion. So it's unusual in 2 ways, because one is that it says, okay, never mind about belonging to a category. If you just have a low income and you are 19 to 64, and your income is up to 138 of the federal poverty level, so $15,856 in 2013 dollars for an individual. Okay? Someone making $7.25 an hour, working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year makes less than that, by the way. Okay, so we're talking about a lot of working people, part-time jobs, seasonal jobs, right? Oh, we can go, I'm sorry. So it's unusual because we say, just if you're poor, we're going to expand this option to you. And remember I said that the federal match was always 50%? The federal financing, to your point, for the first 3 years is 100% of their cost. Every bit of it. So, and this is kind of smart from a state perspective, because utilization is going to go up. People are going like, oh, I'm going to go get checked out. I'm going to go, this thing's been bothering me, and this thing's been bothering me, and I'm going to go get all the stuff done, right? So all of that extra utilization is going to be on the Fed's dime for these people who are newly eligible. And then gradually that financial support is going to phase down until it's 90% of their cost by 2020. That financing arrangement is permanent in law. It doesn't expire. There's no sunset provision. It doesn't change. Remember I talked about the revenue provisions that are baked into the law? Right? The money's already generated to pay for these great outlays of subsidies and Medicaid. You know, so, and people, this is a big, I hear this concern a lot in Concord. Can't trust the feds, they're not gonna, the money's never gonna be there, it's not possible. And right now, my very practical thinking is, well, they're not agreeing about a lot right now, and changing this financing structure would require them to all get together and say, okay, we're changing that financing schedule, and then a sitting president will have to sign it. I think that's unlikely until after 2014. A report by the Lewin Group, which is a national consulting firm, to find out what the impact would be if New Hampshire moves forward with this expansion option. To find out how many people would show up, to find out what it would cost the state, what the impact would be on the state economy, so forth. So Lewin ran a number of scenarios, and the most likely scenario they settled on is that 58,000 people who are newly eligible will show up. Okay, by 2020. Like, that's after years of people knowing about these new coverage options and hearing about the exchange and all that stuff, right? So several of those people will be currently uninsured. Most of them will be currently uninsured. But I want you to be aware there will be people who will leave their private coverage and migrate to public coverage. It's called crowd out. It's just going to happen. It's a fact. Okay? And that's because there are many people who are considered insured, but they have a policy that is a $5,000 deductible and only applies if they break both legs and doesn't help them when they have strep and they need to get antibiotics, right? And if they're making $15,800 or less, going to the doctor is not at the top priority of their expense list, right? So they are considered insured, but it's really not affordable for them. Or they are insured and it's a decent package, but the premiums and the co-pays are really high. And under Medicaid, there is some cost sharing that's permissible, but it's nothing at all in a year. Like right now, for people with incomes under 150% of the federal poverty level, the maximum out of pocket for people in Medicaid is 5% of their annual income. So, you know, that's like between $600, $500 and $800, I think, in a year. The out of pocket maximums in the exchange are $6,000 a year, right? Big difference. So for people who are really in those first low-paying jobs, right, they might, you can understand, purely from an affordability point of view, why they would say, I'm just going to go to the Medicaid coverage, right? Yes, ma'am?
What about dual eligible Medicare?
What about them?
Would someone who has Medicare also be able to get Medicaid?
No, it's for people 19 to 64. Well, they'll still be able to get Medicaid, but they will come in under the traditional Medicaid eligibility rule, right? So, and we will get the routine match for them, 50-50. But for people who come in under the newly eligible rule, we'll get the enhanced match. So it's really a matter of like what the finances look like to the state at that point, right? Okay, so 58,000 people, 20,000 are crowd out. About 3,000 people are going to be people who are eligible right now for the current program and just aren't in the system for whatever reason, right? And then Lewin thought another 4,000, 3,500 people are going to get jobs, and they're going to be high-paying jobs, and they're going to leave Medicaid altogether. Okay. So I just wanted to put, this is from the Lewin report directly. All of these figures are just my recitation of the Lewin report numbers. This is not my research. Just want to be clear, okay? So when the Lewin report examined whether or not, what the impact would be on doing the expansion, what it looked at was what happens in the state if just every other part of the Affordable Care Act operates and we do the Medicaid expansion, or if every other part of the Affordable Care Act operates and we don't do the Medicaid expansion. And that's what's in those last two columns. And so the net essentially is if we do the Medicaid expansion and everything else is operating too, we will insure more people, about 22,000 more people, than if we just let the Affordable Care Act operate on its own without moving forward with the Medicaid expansion. That assumption also presupposes that many people will take up private market options in the absence of a Medicaid expansion. I really question whether or not that will be financially feasible for people. And we'll talk about why in a little while. Okay. So this is their big picture overview. What happens to the state budget, the one that they fight about in Concord every 2 years? What happens to the state budget if we do this over the next 7 years? So 58,000 people. The feds pump in $2.5 billion over those years into the state economy, primarily through the healthcare sector. The state cost in aggregate over that same amount of time is $85 million. Okay, now to put that in context, in state dollars, we spend $700 million on Medicaid every year, right now. 85 million over 7 years is about a percentage point or two more than what we're going to spend if we don't change our Medicaid program at all right now. Okay? And we're going to cover 40% more people. Just to give you like a sense of the scale. The Lewin report also identified a number of offsets, so savings that the state budget would achieve because dollars that they use right now to cover people, the feds will now cover those people. Okay? And so, but that's if everything, like 67 million, that's if all of the savings in all the categories that they identified are achieved. Okay? Okay, let's go on. The state is also currently initiating managed care into its Medicaid program. It's contracted with three managed care companies to administer the Medicaid program. And that prior slide was in a fee-for-service context. This is in a managed care context. So if we go forward with that initiative and we actually get it off the ground, in addition to the savings, there'll be revenue generated to the state because every premium that we pay to the managed care companies, they have to pay a 2% tax back out. So that generates $49 million over the same 7 years. So that almost well, more than cuts the general fund cost in half. And then if you apply savings, all of the savings on top of that, you get to a net savings to the state over 7 years. Can we go to the next chart? What I really want you to take away from this is that if everything comes up sunshine and puppies, we'll get a net savings to the state for doing the Medicaid expansion. There's a good likelihood, however, that we might be able to simply get to a budget neutral place where it doesn't cost any more to cover 40% more people, right? Or if you don't count any of the revenue and any of the savings, it's a percentage point or two more than what we're currently spending to cover 40% more people in our Medicaid program. So I don't know whether all the revenue and the savings can be reached or achieved, okay? And anybody who conquered, but I think budget neutrality is a very real possibility. The state could get to a place, especially in a managed care setting, where essentially that cost is nothing or de minimis, right? Okay. Let's go on. So we run our budgets in 2-year cycles. So right now we're crafting the 14 and 15 budget in Concord. So the general fund cost, according to the Lewin Group, is a little less than $6 million. And then we're going to get a bunch of revenue and a bunch of savings. And in addition to that, $422 million is going to come into the state from the feds in the next 2 years, next 2 fiscal years, if we do this. Okay, let's go on. And then there's the report identified a number of economic benefits that will happen. And essentially, what it said was everything's going to go up. Gains in personal income, gains in gross state product, provider revenue, and jobs will increase if we do the Medicaid expansion and if we don't. And the difference between the two isn't gargantuan, but apparently the Medicaid expansion maximizes all the economic benefits that will accrue to the state. Okay? A part of the report says some providers do better than others, and says that because our Medicaid reimbursement rates are so low, that some hospitals will not make as much money if we do the Medicaid expansion as compared to if we don't. So what they're saying is, because they assume that a large number of people will choose the private market in the absence of a Medicaid expansion, the private market has higher reimbursement rates, that even though we're covering fewer people, the reimbursement rates will be higher, and therefore the hospitals will net out more money. But that's an aggregate figure of all 26 hospitals in the state. And as you guys all know, hospitals are not created equally, right? Critical access hospitals compared to PPS hospitals, urban hospitals compared to rural hospitals may have very different balance sheets, very different funding streams that come into them. And it's my understanding that the state is working on a third report, which will in part look at the individual impact of the Medicaid expansion on individual hospitals. That's something I've heard burbling around Concord. If I see it, I'll definitely let Linda know. Okay? It doesn't say that the hospitals lose money for doing from where they are today for doing the Medicaid expansion. It says that they don't do as well as in aggregate all of the health systems in the state if we're going forward. However, the New Hampshire Hospital Association has come out and said that they're in favor, regardless of the specifics of the report, that they're in favor of going forward with the Medicaid expansion, right? And I think that's where, in part, some money is better than no money, right? The reimbursement rates might be low, but at least they'd be there for a bunch more people. And because really you are talking about healthcare providers, and at some point there is just this sense among them that people should be covered, right? Okay. The uncompensated care costs for community health centers and community mental health centers goes down drastically. Community health centers and community mental health centers take care of people who come in with no money, with some money. Being insured or being adequately insured is not part of how they do business, right? So a large proportion of the business they do takes care of people that can pay a little bit or nothing at all. So their uncompensated care costs will go down on the order of 79 and 80% if we go forward with the Medicaid expansion. And when you look at how hospitals fare, if you just count the amount of money that we give to hospitals for taking care of people in Medicaid and people who can't pay anything at all, their uncompensated care costs go down by 20%. So it's not nothing. Okay, let's go forward. Household health spending will go down across the state by $92 million if we do the Medicaid expansion. And then there's a number of other features. I think what's really interesting is the idea that private market premiums are going to go down a little bit under either scenario. A third of a percentage point, basically, either way we do it. Right? And then that we cover more people if we do the Medicaid expansion than if we don't. And the next slide is really, if you don't remember anything else about this part of the presentation, it's this. The Affordable Care Act is really going to bring a lot of economic activity to the state. Doing the Medicaid expansion kind of maxes out that benefit and really helps us to optimize the benefit for the state. That's what the report says. Okay. Should we go on? So if we don't take the money, if we don't take the $2.5 billion, this weird thing happens because of how the Supreme Court decision came down. So the subsidies in the exchange start at 100% of the federal poverty level. They aren't available generally to people with incomes less than that. Because when the drafters of the statute were drafting, the expansion was mandatory. So they said, well, most people are going to be captured by Medicaid. There's going to be some folks who won't be captured because their immigration status, you have to be legally present in the United States to access Medicaid. So for the people who are legally present, but are within the 5-year bar, they can't get Medicaid. So some of the subsidies for people under 100% would be for those folks. But for people without that immigration status, there is no subsidy if you have income below 100% of the federal poverty level. Does that make sense? Okay, so it's just because of the way that the Supreme Court decision came down. So one of the questions about not taking the Medicaid, not taking the money, is that we sort of leave people in this place of they can't get Medicaid and they can't get a subsidy to help them defray the cost of private market. They can still shop there. But the limit that they're up against is, will this private market coverage cost you less than 8% of your income? Probably not, right? If they make 100% of the federal poverty level for one person is $11,490 this year. Okay, so it doesn't seem likely that a private market plan would cost them less than that, than 8% of that, right? So they won't have the financial incentive to buy. For many people who are in the income eligibility group of who's going to show up for Medicaid, they also have income so low that they won't even be subject to the individual mandate, because the individual mandate only applies if you have to file federal income tax. And there is a threshold at which if you have income below that, it's somewhere around $9,000, between $9,000 and $10,000. You don't have to file federal income tax, right? So they won't be subject to the individual mandate, and even if they are, 70% of them won't have access to the subsidies available in the exchange that might make shopping there affordable for them. So there's a real risk of leaving people in what one of my partner organizations calls a coverage canyon, right? There's no way to get them out. And then, of course, to this gentleman's point, we leave the money on the table. We also don't get that additional economic benefit of bringing a few $1 billion into the state economy. Questions about that? You guys are a really quiet group. People tend to be a little hot around this issue, but you guys are really calm. Okay.
Why would 70% of people that you were talking about in that last slide not be eligible for subsidies?
Because the subsidies start at if you have income below 100% of the federal poverty level, they're not written into the statute for you.
Yes.
So ironically, their incomes are too low
Yeah.
to get a subsidy. Just because when they wrote the statute, they imagined that Medicaid and the subsidies would overlap, right? Okay. So my firm did a little bit of work and looking at what are the occupational groups of people who will be eligible for the Medicaid expansion. And these are the groups we found that had the most uninsured adults in households with this income range are in these categories. So for the most part, you're talking about people who have to show up physically for work, right? So janitors, school bus drivers, wait staff, department store clerks, discount store clerks, landscapers, construction workers are likely to be people who are income eligible and are in need of insurance right now. That's not the Lewin report. That's our own little research. Okay, let's go on. And then there's the rub with managed care. So like I said, the Medicaid program has contracted with 3 companies to administer the managed care in the Medicaid program. And in those when the contracts were signed, the expansion was mandatory. So we've told them you can have that business because we thought we had to do it. And it's my suspicion they really want that business because the folks, the newly eligible adults, look most like the commercially insured of anybody because they're probably working and they're probably well. Otherwise, they would actually already be somehow in the Medicaid program, right?
Can you
So-
explain a little more about
Yep.
what managed care organizations are? What do they mean by managed care?
Sure. So that's a big question. Okay. So managed care is what most people in the commercially insured world think of as their HMO, right? It's an it's an insurance company that acts as sort of like the three-way broker between the payer, who in the private market is usually the employer, right? Or a university. And the members, the people who are covered by the insurance, and the providers. And they contract with the providers to provide the appropriate benefits to the people who are enrolled with them, right? And they, and they use certain tools and resources to make sure that people use and access healthcare resources in an effective and appropriate manner. And in this particular instance, we're talking about contracts that are capitated, full risk contracts, right? So the managed care companies get a fixed per member per month cost for every person enrolled with them, and that fee paid to them is based on the person's eligibility. So because I'm a 40-something woman, my rate would probably be somewhere around $400 a month, right? And they get that payment for me every month I'm enrolled with them, no matter that I never go to the doctor. Let's say I'm a bad preventer. I don't get my blood drawn, I eat lots of cheeseburgers, but I don't go at all, okay? So the risk comes in when in the second year I show up and I need quadruple bypass surgery because I'm a bad accessor of healthcare resources and I have terrible heart disease. They still only get $400 a month for my care, even though the cost of my care may well exceed what they've been paid for me to date and what they may get for me for the remainder of the year, right? That's where the risk comes in. So we have contracts with three companies to administer that program. So they're going to contract with providers, pay claims to the providers, get paid by the state, and coordinate care for the beneficiaries who are enrolled with them. That's going to be their job, in a nutshell. Oh, can we go back just a little bit? So we have a very small Medicaid enrollment. We have the smallest Medicaid enrollment of any of the New England states, even though we're more populous than some of our New England neighbors. Dividing that population up by 3 ways, 132,000 people by 3 ways isn't a lot for 3 companies to fight over. And without the Medicaid expansion, I really wonder about the viability of them moving forward. Because of the type of managed care we've chosen, we have to have at least 2 companies to meet federal requirements. So it kind of throws a little bit of a wrinkle into something that the state is already pursuing. It's not something that a good contract attorney couldn't get the state out of, right? The state passes a law that says we're not doing the Medicaid expansion. The contracts are governed by state law. They say, well, governed by state law, done, right? Everybody pays a little money and goes home. But that's not really the issue. The state is trying to use managed care to really push payment reform and health service delivery reform into New Hampshire, right? To make sure that people get patient-centered medical homes, that they get coordinated care, that we are paying at the appropriate setting for the appropriate care. It's just the beginning, right, of really trying to issue an era of reform into healthcare services in New Hampshire. And so to the extent that the Medicaid expansion plays a role in that and that not doing the Medicaid expansion interrupts that, there's, I think, some real thinking to be done around that.
It's important to the state budget.
And it's important to the state budget. It does generate a fair amount of savings and hopes to generate a fair amount of savings in this biennium for sure, and was expected to in the last, but it hasn't got off the ground. Yes?
A couple of slides ago, there was a data point, and I was hoping to clarify for me if it's a state or federal statistic, and it was that we anticipate that 80% of the uncompensated care will be diminished by 80% for the community physical and mental health.
For the community health centers and community mental health centers, right.
Is that a state or nationwide statistic?
That's in New Hampshire.
That's New Hampshire only.
Right, that's a New Hampshire specific
Thank
figure.
you.
Yeah. So the Medicaid expansion is in the governor's budget. It's in the House budget. The Senate's building its budget right now. I expect there will be a political skirmish about that. I really couldn't tell. I honestly don't know what's going to happen. Yes?
What's not clear to me is what is the downside of not doing the Medicaid expansion? Obviously, you're in favor of it, and so is a lot of other people. But
Right.
what's the argument against doing it?
So, right. So the argument that I hear the most is that the money won't be there. Right?
Oh.
Like the really favorable financing.
Can't trust the feds.
Right, that it won't be there. Sometimes I hear philosophical arguments that we should figure out a way to do this without involving the federal government, that there has to be a state way to do that for the same amount of money.
Local control.
Local control, right.
Versus being in debt, essentially. And
Or worrying that we go forward with it, the federal financing disappears, and then what do you do?
yeah.
Because you've promised this benefit, and
Yeah,
that's
and you're in it.
right?
Yeah.
And then what? And how do you finance that? Or how do you get around the difficulty, right? Because Medicaid is counter-cyclical traditionally. Medicaid enrollment expands when the economy goes in the tank, right? Or when there's a great public health crisis, like the AIDS crisis of the 80s and 90s. Many states opened up an optional group for people who were living with or suffering from HIV and AIDS in order to find a way to compensate someone for their costs because it was so crazy expensive and acute, right? And so Medicaid traditionally is one of the biggest, if not the biggest component of a state budget because of all the federal dollars that come into it. So that's usually the downside. And there are people who think, well, since the numbers are so favorable for the rest of the Affordable Care Act, let's just see if the private market will do almost as well as the public option, the Medicaid expansion, and we'll deal with those people who might be permanently uninsured some other way. Yes, sir.
I'm not completely clear yet on the function of the insurance exchanges. Who can shop there? What can you get there? Is it an alternative for individuals to buy insurance there rather than through another private insurer?
Right.
How does that work? What is
So it's for people shopping on the individual insurance market and the small group market. Okay, so and actually you don't have to be income. Anybody can shop there who is shopping in either one of those markets. What you get inside of an exchange is a set of plans that meet all of these 10 categories of essential health benefits, and then you will also be able to make what's called sort of apples to apples comparisons, so that you'll be able to see which level of benefit they each provide and what the cost sharing is to you. So whether that plan covers 60% of the cost or 70% of the cost or 90% of the cost, and you get the level of benefit that fits what you need as a healthcare consumer and what you want in terms of what you can afford. It's sort of a way to, I think, bulk up what is offered on the individual market and give people an easier way to see what's available to them. And it's the only place where people will be able to access the subsidies that are available to them if they have the appropriate income range. You can still shop in the individual market outside of an exchange and a small group market outside of an exchange. Those remain uninterrupted. The benefit for most people will be that they can access their subsidies there and only there. They're not available any other way. Yes, sir.
Can a company under 50 employees,
Oh, here we go.
10, 15 employees,
Yeah.
okay, has the option at this point in time, or currently has an option, to look at the providers that are available today, select a plan that works for them,
Yeah.
and make a decision as to how much they want to pay the employee with participation. That's current. Now, they're introducing hearing is now when they have the exchange. So could a company with 3 or 4 or 5, 6 individuals say, okay, fine, you go out on the exchange and we'll subsidize you, we'll pay a portion, or you can get fully insured
Yeah.
because that's the amount of money we can pay?
Right, absolutely. There absolutely will be the option for employers with fewer than 50 folks. They'll be able to shop. And at some point, not in the first year, but in some point, what I understand is that employers will be able to go and give their employees choice of any of the products available there and say, instead of saying we're buying this product as a small group in the exchange, and hopefully in the out years 16, 17, 18, employers will be able to go there and say to their employees, this is what we're contributing towards your premium. You choose which product works for you. How the rating and the risk adjustment happens with that, I'm not clear about.
Can that employee also get the subsidy from the government within the?
I don't know. That's an excellent question. I don't know. There was a question here, and then here, and then here.
Over 50. Does the same apply? What happens with a 51?
Over, so it's my understanding that companies over 50 will be able to access exchanges by 2017. That's technically what's on the books. Right, we'll see how it pans out. Right? Because there will, I'm sorry, go ahead. And there might be a lot of advantages to using an exchange for an employer if all of the capacity that they are talking about actually comes to fruition. So for example, if an employer went to an exchange and offered it to everybody and they could choose from any plan, then instead of getting an individual bill for every employee, they just get an aggregate bill from the exchange that says this is what your folks want, this is what you're going to pay, and or organizing it in such a way that the employee can use a contribution from one employer and like my employer and then take the contribution from my husband's employer and we take those and go shop. Those are supposed to be options available. I don't think they're available necessarily in the first year. But, and then helping with things like administrative work, like enrollment and just a lot, what cafeteria plans, anybody have Section 125 plans? Things that tend to be a little more onerous for smaller businesses. But the exchange, theoretically, is supposed to be able to offer some of that assistance, take some of the HR administrative burden away from some of the employers that shop with them. But again, that's all, it's theory.
Where are these exchanges? Where are they posted? How do you get into them?
Well, there's supposed to be a website, a call center. I'm not sure that there's going to be a storefront. I think there will be. But there are also supposed to be like places you can go, like identified places you can go that should be places that are identified as you can apply for exchange coverage here. So the feds haven't come in yet and said, we're opening shop at this location, to my knowledge. Right?
We currently have a broker who kind of does that for us.
Right.
We could just go to him and say.
Right.
So that's none of that's changed. We don't have to literally be the one on the internet shopping for it. We can just call the broker and say, this is what we want to do, give us the factors.
Right, that's my understanding. And there are going to be people called navigators who are going to be more of enrollment and eligibility people to help people figure out, who are, I think, primarily working in the individual market, how to access all of this stuff for themselves. But I don't think that navigators and brokers precisely do the same thing, because I think of navigators much more as doing outreach and enrollment and helping people really with the very double click here, put your name in that box, sort of functions. Did you have a question, or was it? I'm sorry. Hold on. Just yes, ma'am.
I'm with a small business and currently provide health insurance for my employees. Unfortunately, the ones that have opted to take it, for the most part, are over between 45 and 60 years old.
Right.
The rest of them have decided because of the cost, they don't want to participate.
Right.
So it's probably because I'm told that our insurance rates are going to go up 20 to 25%. Probably more feasible for me to say, fine, we're not going to offer health insurance anymore. You're going to have to go to the exchange and get it on your own. Now, if I decide that I'm going to supplement my currently eligible employees, what happens if it bumps them up into the next income category?
Right. Yeah, well, you have to talk to them about that. Like, I don't know how that, but I see your question, right? Like, how do you make it work for you and them?
Yeah.
right? How do you still, I had a senator say to me recently that he thought that an appropriate business makes enough to offer health insurance to their employees, right?
I raised my costs that I charge people, the amount that the insurance companies have raised it, I'd be out of business.
Right.
And there's no way I can afford to provide insurance anymore.
Right. So how you meet whatever your personal sense of what your obligation is to your employees and how you make it work for them income-wise, that's a discussion you guys are going to have to work out. But the hope behind the exchanges is that they make all those conversations and those creative solutions easier.
But they're only giving us 3 months to do it.
Not harder.
October, we're getting
Right.
this information, and we have to have it done by January 1st.
That's what you call a broker.
Right. 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 It's not right. It's not a panacea. It's not perfect. Right. It's moving the conversation forward in terms of creating the norm that everybody's covered, and then once you take the uncompensated care question primarily off the table, getting to the harder conversation about why are healthcare costs continuing to go up. Right, which is just as much of a hard conversation, if not harder, than the one we had about how do we even get to approximately universal coverage. Were there other here and then here?
One more.
Well, I came
Oh,
today
one more.
because I had some questions about the Affordable Care Act, specifically for nursing mothers and pregnant women, because I'm the woman that was in last week's paper where I was fired for breastfeeding. So I wanted to, in violation of the Affordable Care Act, so I wanted to ask you just if you could cover that more than that one little sentence, or just go over it again.
Right. So my understanding of the obligation that this applies to all employers, but employers with 50 or fewer can try to waive out of it. That they give employees who are nursing a reasonable amount of time to nurse, a reasonable break time to nurse at work, right? That's my understanding. And the little I've read about it is that the standard under which an employer can not do that is whether or not it would be an undue burden on, it's, I think, probably very similar to the ADA standard for a reasonable accommodation. Whether it's an undue burden on the employer. But honestly, that's as much as I can say about it, and wish you the best of luck with your situation.
Thank you.
Sure.
So, well, I think that, as I said, it's impossible to answer all the questions.
We
It's
went all the way
evolving.
through the
It's
time.
very much in
Right.
process. And I want to thank Deb for her generosity of giving us extra time already today.
Oh, sure.
And here's a small gift of
Isn't that nice?
appreciation.
Thank you. Well, I really appreciate it. Thanks so much.
And I'll just make mention, our guest next month is the new commissioner of DREAD. As I've said, for our tourism and economic development to be referred to as DREAD, to me, I think we need to change that acronym. But at any rate, it's Jeff Rose, and we will be here next month. Thank you.